everyone. Welcome back to Christian's Colloquy. I'm Christian, and I'm so glad that you could join us today as we have a very interesting topic. With me here, as you can see on your screen or in the title if you're listening as a podcast, I have Lue-Yee. Lue-Yee, welcome aboard again. How are you doing?
Thank you. Doing all right. How are you?
I'm well. It's so nice to have you on again. For those who maybe are new to the channel or haven't seen it, Lue-Yee and I had a conversation quite some time ago. It was one of my earlier interviews. We talked about Anglicanism, the Book of Common Prayer, and we got a bit into fasting. So that's a very interesting conversation. If you are interested in just a foundational sort of look at Anglicanism and what it's about, I recommend you check out that interview. Lue-Yee does a fantastic job. And I think I asked some good questions myself. So I recommend that. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. But as people can expect, the conversation continues. We have a lot more that we could talk about in this realm of issues and theological points. But today, this is the beginning of sort of maybe a series or a little bit of a project. As a lot of you who are listening or watching are aware, recently, Prince Philip of the Commonwealth countries, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, died, and that was a big blow for a lot of us. I know in Canada that was something we talked about a lot. We mourned. I know for people around the world in Commonwealth countries or who are interested in the Commonwealth in England, and I know Anglicans globally who have that connection, were talking about it and thinking about it. So today I thought, why not get started talking about the kings and queens of England and their relation to religion? I know that's a question we often have. We're often thinking about it. And now I think we're thinking about it again. So today with this episode, I have Lue-Yee on. And long story short, we're going to go way back to the origins or the foundation points of what today we typically think of Anglicanism, rooted in the English Reformation. And we'll be talking about those early English kings of the English Reformation period that are often either talked about in a specific historical light or are pinned as maybe good guys or bad guys, depending where you're coming from. So Lue-Yee is going to be talking about Edward VIII or Henry VIII and Edward VI. I think I got those numbers right.
Edward VIII, not a fan.
But... Edward VIII, not a fan. Forget that guy. No. So we're talking about Henry VIII, Edward VI, and hopefully I don't confuse them as we speak. There's Henrys, there's Edwards, there's James, there's Charleses, and there's all sorts. But we're talking about those first two that we associate with the English Reformation. And then we will see what we have in terms of future interviews. But anyway, long enough of me talking. Lue-Yee, why don't you just introduce us to the figure, the personality, or the history of Henry VIII? Who is he, and why would we be talking about him now?
Oh dear. Well, I think Henry is best known for his his history with women and its intersection with the religious history of England. So, I mean, tired, 6 kids, wired, 6 wives.
Yeah, right. Oh boy.
But yeah, so I think a lot of people who are not well acquainted with Anglicanism do think of the history of Anglicanism as something that was political, and by political they mean bad,
right?
Or or that it was just a matter of being a papist without the Pope part, because you make Henry the new Pope, and that's how it goes. So I think that's something that is good to revisit, because I think a lot of that is myth making by either papists, who certainly have an interest in this question, or by other people who are not papists but want to have a dig at Anglicanism.
Right. So just very briefly, when you use the term papist, I know some people might not know the term, and other people might think of the term and go, "Oh, why is he using that? What is that term referring to? What is maybe the history of that term? Who are we talking about here?"
Well, we're talking about people who would call themselves Roman Catholics, or people who are I mean, I just think of them as the groupies of the papacy. So
Right. Okay. So Roman Catholics, and it's the association with the Pope in Rome, the papacy. So,
right.
and they would have an issue with Henry and the English Reformation. You mentioned that
Oh, very
it
interesting.
it would be what's going on with Henry? Why Henry specifically would they have an issue with? What did he do, or what was he about?
Well, it was under Henry that the Church of England threw off the shackles of the Bishop of Rome. So um, naturally, if they can claim that your sect originated at this time and not with the foundation of the church, and your sect was founded in the circumstances of a dubious um, quest for a son and a dubious divorce,
Right.
then uh, then they're able to paint this picture of the English Reformation as something that should never have happened, as something that led to the kind of cultural decline um, that we might see today.
Right. So it really is. It's brought up as a way to crack at the foundation of Anglicanism as a movement, or as a perhaps a denomination, using that term, with theological conviction. It's sort of say, hey, it started with this guy trying to find a wife who could have a son. So how could it really offer anything as a robust Christian organization or group or
Right,
sect or
right,
whatever it
right.
might be? So we hear that a lot. I know I've heard that in when I was taking classes at the University of Toronto, a secular school. We were doing English history, and they presented it as, yeah, Anglicanism is, if you look at the history, Roman Catholicism without the Pope. And I think a lot of that goes to what they say Henry did and what he was about. So maybe broaden the picture for us a little bit. Was that the single-minded issue for Henry? Was that what all that it was around the start of Anglicanism? What else informs Anglicanism, the Church of England, really, I guess, to use that term, and their divide from the Church of Rome? What's going on there?
Well, so I think in terms of what was going on in Henry's mind, of course, you know, toward the beginning of the Reformation, well, in response to Luther, Henry was very down on that, and he even got the title Defender of the Faith from the Bishop of Rome because he had written stuff against Luther.
Right.
Not a promising start for the sympathizers of the evangelicals in England at the time. Um, but meanwhile, even before this. Even before the marriage stuff, the marriage troubles happened with Henry, Thomas Cranmer had, gone to gone to the continent as a diplomat. He'd secretly married the niece of a reformer. So
Mm.
I think it was, yeah, I don't remember which one it was, but anyway, um, so there was this stuff already going on. I mean, this ferment was affecting all of Europe. I think in our own time, we tend to think of these hard lines between papists and Protestants, but at the time, it was just a movement that was taking hold in many parts of Europe. People were talking, and even the people that we call, that we associate with the papists now, uh, people like Pohl and Bonner and what's his name, Gardner. These were some figures later on of the reaction against um, the Reformation in England, but at the time there was just a wide spectrum of views because people were just talking, and the Council of Trent had not happened yet, so a lot was just very much up in the air. So when this Henry thing started, yeah, I mean, basically he was the second king of his dynasty, and uh, this had happened just after the Wars of the Roses. The dynastic succession of his father Henry VII was not really that secure. I mean, his claim was not actually that strong, but he'd won a civil war. Um, so in those circumstances, yeah, you certainly want to uh, not descend back into the Wars of the Roses. Um, so naturally, these are going to be background concerns.
Right. And that really to use the term, it complicates our understanding of the Reformation history. And it really, when you think about it, in the common telling of the narrative, oh, Henry needed a new wife to have a son. That
He was a
misses
real
that.
skirt chaser.
Yeah,
Or
exactly. And that's how people really present them. But there is
yeah,
that rich political history going on, those concerns, but also it's undeniable that the Reformation was sweeping across Europe, that these thoughts were out there. It wasn't just Henry arbitrarily saying, hey, new wife, and I guess that means new religion. So here it is. There really is a fluid relationship going on. And especially in those early days when the hard lines weren't being as clearly drawn as they would be at around the time of Trent, where these things were formalized. So I guess the question, knowing a bit of this complicated history, and knowing that that might be better known in Anglican circles where there's a vested interest in understanding where you come from, especially defending yourselves from either Roman Catholics and their claims, and maybe other Protestants, dissenters, and their claims about Anglicanism and that kind of thing. So, how would an Anglican today, speaking about perhaps your specific stream of Anglicanism, which I know you're deeply invested in, the 39 articles and that robust early tradition that uh, might reject later moves to other sides. So the prayer book tradition, I know you're a fan of the prayer book. So how would someone in your perhaps narrow stream that sticks to the roots of the English Reformation, how would you speak about Henry, or how would you view Henry in the context of your faith and identity today?
I would say, first of all, this is not just the history of those who call themselves Anglican. I think it's important that this part of the English Reformation belongs to everyone. So it belongs to Anglicans, it belongs to the Presbyterians, it belongs to the Congregationalists, it even belongs to the Baptists.
Mm,
So I think if we're able to see this as part of our common history, then it's not something that becomes like this Anglican scandal that nobody else has to deal with, because it's really some of the early stages of the Reformation that we all share.
right. So, and that I'm glad you said that. Where I think Baptists and other groups need to appreciate the common origins, and I know I've been doing a little bit of work on that, where it's easy to establish, oh, this history. Look at the moves later on and see it as, oh, I need to pick that apart, or I need to disassociate. But I think that's a great place to start healthy dialogue when we
Do you
recognize.
disavow Henry VIII?
So it would be lovely if we didn't talk like that, but instead
He's
appreciate, hey,
cancelled.
yeah, we don't cancel Henry, but better appreciate, hey, we have a common origin here where, hey, we trace back to this English church and people who desired further reformation, or perhaps you could say maybe a bit sectarian. I know we definitely have different perspectives on that. We could talk about those another time, but that helps to understand that he is broader than what we call Anglicanism today. He is a figure in English Christian history and English religious history, and that's worth considering. So, maybe just a brief question. I don't know if you've come across this before, but people will often say that the Church of England under Henry was truly uh, just the Roman Catholic Church without the Pope. And it's as simple as that. You already alluded to that there was a conversation going on, that there was different movements back and forth, and people's minds would change. Henry had voices that he was listening to and sometimes not listening to. But Henry, as we know, wasn't always acting as you would expect a Roman Catholic to act. He has that bit about the monasteries that people will sometimes talk about, and a few other things. But maybe are there any issues related to Henry that you are aware of that you wish other people knew about, or you wish people better understood about Henry?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that Henry, I mean, he wasn't like a top tier intellectual, but he saw himself as someone who, lived among intellectuals, was in that world. And so when he had his marriage troubles and all that, um, his the question of his annulment was something that was debated all over Europe.
Mm.
I mean, even I think even Melanchthon, Philip Melanchthon, one of the Lutheran reformers, had suggested maybe he should consider having two wives
Oh, interesting.
instead of getting rid of one of them, and that was so people were thinking about alternatives to um, the, the path that he finally took.
Mm.
Um, he was just not convinced that that was going to work because he was convinced that that God had cursed his marriage because it was a fake marriage, because his wife was had been the wife of his brother, which, as we know from the Bible, is not allowed because John the Baptist had confronted Herod Antipas about exactly the same thing. You can't
Right.
have your brother's wife.
Mm. Interesting. And that really does add maybe a question. I don't know if you know the answer. I'm just thinking about this. Would Henry himself would he have read these papers being put out by Melanchthon and other figures? Would he have heard those arguments and weighed them? Do you know anything about that?
I think so. I think there were agents going back and forth between
Right.
England and the continent. So people were actually writing directly to Henry
Mm.
sometimes, suggesting this and that. Or even if they didn't, they'd be writing to his advisors,
Right.
Cranmer among them.
Yeah. And that really is interesting. I would love to get my hands on some of that. I imagine like people suggesting multiple wives might look at the patriarchs and see how they did that. I'm not sure if that's the greatest example, but it might address some of those issues. But it'd be
In the
interesting.
end, in
Yeah.
some other place, Philip of Hesse actually did end up having two wives.
Right, which I remembered hearing something about that. So that was something that happened. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, that was not. I mean, of course, Europe had a monogamous norm formally, but of course, some
yeah.
kings would have
Kings
side chicks.
especially, I imagine. Yeah, a little too much
Some of them
salt in.
more official than others.
Right, right. Okay, well, that helps, and that's something I think people, when they think about Henry and think about this history, recognizing that it wasn't just a man guided by a particular part of his body or a particular desire for a son. It sounds like he had a real strong religious conviction there that
Right.
may have grown over time, or maybe it was played up. We can't read his heart, but we could
Right.
certainly understand that there's more than just what is often presented. Oh, Henry liked all the Roman Catholic stuff, but just wanted a son. Well, there's a lot more going
Yeah.
on: politics, religion, and personal conviction. So that helps to I think encourage people to dig deeper into history. I know for a lot of figures, that's something we're better at now, where we're not satisfied with the one-dimensional narrative. We want to hear both sides, and that's a project I would encourage. So keeping us going here, Edward the Sixth. I think that's his number. Yes, it is. Yes, he is also another major figure of Anglicanism before that period of Elizabeth, and that's of course. I believe maybe I'm overstepping here, but I think Elizabeth is really a central figure in what we have today in terms of Anglican formularies and that kind of stuff that sets the
Mhm.
trajectory with her and the theologians around her. But
Yeah,
before
that's right.
that, Edward, big figure. I know myself and a lot of other more dissentery, hardcore, reform, Puritan kind of guys. We love Edward. I'll jokingly call him
I do too.
my Josiah, and
So
it's
do I.
so do you. So
We love
maybe
Edward here.
love Edward here. Let's talk about maybe our common appreciation about him. Why does Edward, the boy king, or all these other terms he have, why does he stick out in this history despite dying so young? What was he about?
Well, I think for one, he had a clearer idea of uh, where the Reformation was going. I think
Mm.
Henry had indeed unleashed uh, things in his during his quest. It was not just the analogy with what John the Baptist had lost his life criticizing Herod Antipas for. It was also under Henry. I mean, it had also unleashed questions of who the supreme governor of the church in this realm is. So not the Bishop of Rome, but the king. And people were talking about, analogies of the Old Testament and how, Josiah killed priests, Solomon deposed priests, all these things that show at least that having the king or having a king do these things in a Christian commonwealth is not at least intrinsically contrary to natural law. So there was these kinds of like two kingdoms issues related to justification by faith alone, and what the relation is um, between the heavenly kingdom and the earthly kingdom, both kingdoms of Christ. So there were these issues, and even during the lifetime of Henry VIII, there were the 10 articles, there were the 6 articles. So Henry himself had waffled on some of these things. He'd gone kind of toward Lutheranism and stepped back from Lutheranism. But in the reign of Edward VI, the Reformation in England became much more discernibly a reformed movement, as opposed to just a sort of Lutheran or Lutheranizing change. It took on a much more reformed shape.
Right. And that's something I think people today, I hear Anglicans discussing their history. And of course, it does often take the shape of, well, which monarch will we closely align with? Well, I'm more in favor of the early days where it was more Lutheran, or some people, and we know some guys like this who are all about that reform period, and later on people like the more middle of the road between Geneva and Wittenberg, and then of course we know some people who like the much higher end, and they'll really appreciate either James or Charles, one of them, a lot more. And I think it's I know you have an appreciation of the
well,
Caroline
after Henry,
divines.
they're all reformed.
They're all reformed, but they take on different flavors, and people will speak of them in different ways. So maybe thinking a bit more about Edward and this reformed connection, and maybe this transition from a more Lutheran period. I know we've spoken a bit about how the English church, as it was becoming more and more reformed and perhaps aware of that, sought connections with the continental churches. And that would be, I know, one of your favorite figures later on. He would carry on that tradition, attending the Synod of Dort, and we'll talk about that in the future, I'm sure. But what were some of these early connections between the Reformed Church of England during the period of Edward and maybe the continental Reformed churches? Who were some of the big players there on both sides, perhaps?
Yeah, so it looks like early on in under Edward VI, some of the big connections were actually with Zurich. And I think that's a neglected part of the Continental Reformation as well, because I think some people want to ignore Zurich because it's associated with Zwingli and Presbyterians or whoever want to be associated more with Calvin than with Zwingli. But actually, yeah, after Zwingli, his successor Bullinger was very, very influential in England. His decades were required reading in the universities. So actually, one of the commonalities between Zurich and England is the role of the magistrate in the church, which was much more emphasized in both places than it tended to be in Geneva or Scotland or some of these other places.
Right. Interesting. And I could say, coming from my studies into the Swiss Reformation, it was interesting to see how certain English figures, Bishop Hooper, I believe, or someone along those lines, he loves Zwingli, but he was sort of recognized among his peers as a bit more radical. But seeing those connections and seeing that connection on the issue of the magistrate, I think that again adds a layer where the Church of England wasn't, for at least in this period, wasn't a isolated body or totally disconnected. It was part of the broader movement of Reformation in those conversations, which I think a lot of people today, and I know maybe I'll let you speak to that in a moment, where there's a lot of controversy over names in Anglicanism. Are we Protestant? Are we Reformed? Are we Catholic? And and I know you would claim we're all those things, but how we're all those things is a bit of a tricky question. But it seems to me that recognizing the broader conversation, not the isolated story, would help perhaps clarify some of those identity questions. So maybe you want to speak to that. And in what way was the Church of England, or is the Anglican movement today, connected with a broader sense of Catholicity? And the big term right now some people would be aware with is Reformed Catholicity. Can you maybe define that or unpack that or speak to how that relates to you today?
Well, I think I'd start by first mentioning that Anglicanism, being Protestant and Reformed, is explicitly in the oaths that Queen Elizabeth II took
Hmm,
at her coronation in 1953.
right.
She swore to uphold the Protestant and Reformed religion by law established.
Hmm.
So,
I don't think many people would know that or realize the significance of that. That's
yeah,
amazing.
you can read the script online.
Yeah.
You can read the script of the whole
I'll,
coronation.
I'll link to that down below. I'll
Yeah,
make sure to grab that. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so, uh, to me, there is no question of this. This has been the norm from the Reformation all the way until 1953. So, um, some people may be revisionists and want to downplay the Protestant part, downplay the Reformed part. We are Protestant and Reformed. Now,
Hmm,
what exactly that's going to look like is a different question. So, uh, yeah, I've already mentioned the connections and the commonalities with Zurich, but um, one of one of the other things that I think, as the Reformed movement was developing a certain way in later years in Europe, um, I think it seems to have been the opinion of at least some of the clergymen and certainly some of the bishops that that the Protestant movement was maybe not taking the right turns.
hmm,
So it's less of, and I think from the perspective of the people who took those turns, um, England is going to look less Protestant because what they think of as Protestant is their own experience. Whereas from the Anglican point of view, it's it's we who carry on the truest, best Reformation tradition, and it's some of these other people who have taken maybe some turns that we disagree with, and we would hope that they'd return to a more, let's say, central Reformation tradition rather than diverging in what we might consider to be strange directions.
right. Right. And that's where we will often have those hard conversations. But maybe an even harder conversation is that term Catholic. So
Mm.
uh, is the Church of England, is Anglicanism, is that rightly understood Catholic, where people, of course, are going to point out how could a Church of England, or how could a group named after the Angles and the Saxons, how could that be a Catholic church? How does that make any sense? Maybe you want to speak to that a little bit. What are you getting at with that term?
Yeah, well, as Bishop Van Mildert said in the 18th century, the Church of England became Protestant so that she might become more truly Catholic.
Mm. Oh, that's a big
And
claim.
yeah, and what he meant was that by going through the Reformation, it was necessary that England do this in order that it might return to the true doctrine of the apostles and of the early church, the same thing that's taught in the Bible.
Mm.
And that is what defines the institution and the organism that Christ founded, not the fripperies of the Bishop of Rome with his groupies in red, but
Mm.
and their lace, ugh, their lace garments and trinkets of God knows what, with ostrich feather fans and red shoes and kissing of feet. But uh, you know, those things are things that none of the church fathers would have recognized as Christianity, and we just want to return to reject modernity, embrace, return
Right.
to tradition. But
Right.
really, we're the goal of Catholicity here is, or the Catholic, what we consider a Catholic Reformation, is to return to the thing that we recognize from the Church Fathers. I mean, uh, it's the thing that I mentioned uh, to a lot of Romanists is one of the people that you recognize as a pope and a saint, Gregory the Great, was also the same man who, when he heard of the Bishop of Constantinople calling himself a universal bishop, he said any bishop who calls himself a universal bishop, basically that savors of Antichrist.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so we agree with him. We want to return to the pure doctrine of those first centuries wherever we can find it, especially when there's agreement among the church fathers about what really is the substance of the Catholic faith. We want to have that. We want to have the creeds. We want to have the the saintly lives of these people who dedicated their lives to the gospel.
Mm. Yeah, and that really speaks to, I suppose, the more, how can we distinguish perhaps the more moderate reformed movement from the more, we could call them radical reform movement, and not using those terms in any, in trying to communicate anything more than we have a more a softer movement and perhaps a harder movement. I don't know how to phrase it, but I think
I'm
people are
not sure
getting
I'd
my
put
point.
it that way
Yeah,
either,
yeah,
but yeah, yeah.
whatever I'm trying to say here. But I think the main thing about the perhaps the mainstream reform movement in the Church of England, before the Puritans being that further fringe perhaps, or the people seeking further reform, is that there's a stronger draw to the early church and being in conformity with them, where I think the Puritans and a lot of other more perhaps radical reformed figures certainly shared that draw to the church fathers, wanted to talk about them and be in line with them. They weren't perhaps as connected to some things. They weren't as willing to hear them out or perhaps try to assimilate it. They were quicker to say, hey, we don't see that. So and that I think is a place, rather than dividing over that could be a place of having great conversations over, well, what do we think about so and so here, or what do we think about this council here, and how do we make sense of that? So that's the kind of stuff I think we need to be talking about before we just say, those guys are all about the church history. Those guys are all about forgetting the church history. I think when we go to our own history, we see a lot more of that kind of conversation going on. So, but before ending here, I just want to ask now, we have a figure like Henry, we have a figure like Edward, and we know that later on after that, we have Mary, who yeah, she's
Ooh,
interesting.
hiss.
Yeah, she Bloody Mary earned her name with the persecution of reformers, and a lot of people had to flee to the continent, and that's a history. Of course, we recognize the talk about the fluidity of the narrative, that there was atrocities on both sides in a lot of situations. There's no point in running from that or saying that it was only one direction, despite it could feel like that sometimes. But maybe just very briefly, I didn't ask you about this before, but from that period of Mary and her reign, are there any figures or tidbits that come to mind as like, hey, I wish again people knew about this or appreciated this? I know a lot of those people were fleeing to the continent. Are there any perhaps Anglican theologians who made it to the continent that were formed there and that then came back, or anything like that we should know about?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of reformers who, second generation reformers in England who, like John Jewel and some of the
Hmm,
others. And John Knox was involved with the Anglicans as well.
interesting.
And I think there was some controversy in um, I don't remember which city it was, maybe Frankfurt, um, where there were some exiles who wanted to stick with the BCP,
Hmm,
and there were some exiles who wanted um, to worship in a way that was more similar to maybe the locals. Um, and so these disagreements were brought back to England after these exiles, and so you had a broad range of people who'd gone to different cities in Europe, who'd experienced very different things on the continent, and at at the death of Mary, when they returned under Elizabeth, that was they brought all their experiences back, all their struggles, and all their old fights. It's very human.
Right.
um, so then you imprint some of these struggles upon England at large, and you might get a lot of drama, which
Right. And that's where coming from my Baptist upbringing and my tradition today, we'll often look at those times and start to talk about the Puritans at that point, and those guys who are perhaps more strongly connected to those roots they had in the continent. And of course, John Knox, yeah, he went on to be quite a figure in Scotland, and he had certainly some strong opinions about a few things. But that's interesting to think about, and I think that encourages me. There's probably so many stories that we don't know that would be worth getting to know of these, not only these people themselves, but also what they experienced and how that might have influenced. And when you think about it, I think the biggest struggle for people understanding Anglican history and history at large is not only seeing different movements at different times, but also recognizing at the same time, even within the same camp or group, you have different people bringing their experiences, their thoughts. And a lot of the times we see conflicts defined by their individual conflicts, or what we see today as a unified movement was actually the bringing together of various thoughts and various experiences and various perspectives. And that's a history worth exploring. But Lue-Yee, thank you for introducing a lot of these points to us and getting into some of those issues in a big way. We discussed so much. I think people who are interested have a great foundation to learn more, to think more, and to hopefully have conversations of their own. But before we end now, I want to ask, are there any final concluding thoughts about anything related to our discussion today that you would like to share, or a final encouragement or a recommendation? We love recommended reading. So anything that pops into your head?
I think just that history is stranger than fiction sometimes.
Mm,
Even when we track John Knox, um, he went back to Scotland and wrote the Scots Confession with five other guys. But and people think of Knox as this firebrand anti-Anglican, or at least this guy who's contrasted with Anglicanism. But the Scottish Episcopalians, up until basically the early to mid 19th century, were using the Scots Confession written by Knox et al. As their own
wow,
confession of
I did not
faith.
know that.
And
Wow.
the Scots are, considered to be like the most, high churchy of the Anglicans. So that's something that's really, I think, worth thinking about. That all of these people considered themselves to be reformed, and the things that we look at today and we say that doesn't look reformed may not be at all the things that people at the time looked at and said this is not reformed.
Mm,
They might have been totally okay with something and thought, yeah, that's reformed, but that thing's not. And we're like, in our day we may be like, what's the big deal? That looks fine, everyone does that.
right. Wow. And that really, I can imagine where we're projecting, and we often will accuse others of doing this, but I'm sure we struggle with it ourselves. I know I do, where look at what we have today and project that upon the past, where I know you like posting some reform scholastics, or I saw William Perkins quote today where it's he's saying something or they're saying something, and you're like, oh, that doesn't sound quite like I would expect or what I'd say. But we're often reading these guys in light of what came after, and we need to appreciate either the development or just how people themselves viewed themselves at the time, and give them that courtesy, I think, is the main thing, so
Yeah,
that we can better appreciate them. But Lue-Yee, thanks for sharing that, and thanks for coming on today.
thank
we
you.
we discussed so much, and again, I hope to have you on again soon. We could get into some other kings and some other queens and what they were doing and how they relate to our walk in faith today, as truly both of us here, as an Anglican and a Baptist, where we're descendants of this shared history. And unfortunately, it truly is unfortunate, so much of Baptist history has been defined by resistance to a lot of the things you would consider good and right. I've been working on Baptist and the prayer book, and it's hard to appreciate the prayer book when it's because of the prayer book and it being common that Baptists had so much trouble and working through those issues. And I know we were talking earlier, you have some projects that you might be working on soon or coming out soon about different prayer books and things like that. So we have more conversations to come. So everyone, I hope that if you have any questions or any comments about this episode, and especially for Lue-Yee, that you would leave them in the comments below. That I'm sure he'll check them out. I'm sure we'll be talking about it in Discord servers or wherever we are. So please get in touch.
Yeah.
And I hope that everyone watching now will join us again next time here on Christians Colloquy. Anyway, take care.